I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, who is Sarah Green. She is the director of Women at the Well, which is a Catholic charity and a women-only day centre based in the King's Cross area of London. It was founded by the Sister of Mercy, Sister Linda Dearlove, in 2007. And the organization provides practical and emotional support for women facing all kinds of difficulties, including homelessness, addictions, mental health problems, poverty, and debt. And it has a specialism in working with women whose lives are affected by prostitution. Sarah became the CEO at the end of 2023, and she previously worked for more than 20 years on campaigns to end violence against women and in the women's voluntary sector. And she's led campaigns on rape in the justice system, online harms, and sexual harassment in schools. We're very, very honoured to have you with us today. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you as well very much for having Women at the Well as a guest today. I'm going to hope my presentation will immediately share. Let's watch these wonders of technology. That's all right, isn't it? So first of all, for those who don't know us at all, Women at the Well, which many of you will know, it refers to a very special story in the Bible. Women at the Well is a women-only support service in the King's Cross area of London. We're doing practical and emotional support for women who are facing a lot of different disadvantages in their lives. And as Nikki said in her introduction, our specialism is around prostitution and sexual exploitation. So a form of violence against women and girls that many people find very difficult to talk about, and that is bound up with a lot of, at best, kind of cliches, and at worst, very serious minimization and ignorance. So we're going to talk about that a bit today, and I'm going to hopefully connect it to domestic abuse and why these things are part of a spectrum. We're quite small. We employ about 13 people and quite a small turnover, but we run kind of a triple service of a drop-in centre where women can come without appointment. We run advocacy from our little hub centre here in King's Cross. So that's doing the kind of practical support to women to help sort out access to housing, welfare, debt problems, and so on. And we have a small outreach team that goes out, and it goes to the parts of London where there is still some street prostitution. It goes to parts of London where there are also women in like very precarious circumstances and where we know those women might be at risk. An important kind of under-seating part of our work is to try and influence policy and practice towards women who are affected by prostitution while we're doing this work. So we see ourselves as both doing that emotional and practical support that's needed, but also trying to influence the way the rest of society and then law and policy respond to this really, really harmful social problem. Very briefly, some of you will know and some might not, where the organisation comes from. So we were founded by Sister Linda Dearlove, who is one of the Sisters of Mercy. Linda did outreach work with women in prostitution for many, many years in East London. And in the course of doing that work, she came to feel strongly that this is important, this needs to be done. That's the kind of work where you're perhaps like out at night in vans doing hot drinks and emotional support, a bit of befriending and getting to know women and talking to them. But Linda felt strongly we need something else. We need a hub. We need a hub centre that women can come to and stand a chance if they feel like they're ready to try and make a change, where they might stand a chance of getting the wraparound help that we know is necessary to try and make really big changes in your life. So Linda made the case for acquiring a really very special house that we live in King's Cross, and then refitting it to be a purpose-built drop-in centre, and then drawing in quite an army of other sisters from different orders around London, and lots of other women, even of different faiths sometimes, and women of no faith. And we all work together here to try and ensure that we've got the open door and we're creating like realistic opportunities for women to get support, to get their rights to support after all, and to try and make changes if they want to. We are based on very strong Catholic values around having respect for every woman who comes here and who needs our support, working in solidarity with those women, not a different kind of approach, being absolutely fastidious about the dignity of every woman and her life and her chances and her choices. And most of all, we work with hope. So we try to be positive with the open door, and we do believe that change is possible, and we try to impart that and to make it feel real. And I mention hope as well and highlight it most of all because hope is the key kind of value for the Jubilee year that's just starting, isn't it? So I think we're going to do some thinking about how to really enhance our hope message over the next 18 months or so. In terms of why we are needed, so just getting to that a little bit more detail of, what a small service like this is still faces enormous demand for. On our small team of just the 13 workers or so, in the last full calendar year, we had more than 2,000 visits to the drop-in centre. This is a really basic kind of centre where women can get food. We're doing some warm food every day. They can get a change of clothes. We've got hot showers, which are very appreciated. And you can do your laundry, so put your washing through while you're here. And that is all open door, without judgment, without demand, without intrusion, just whatever you need to do when you're here. Our outreach team at the same time and during the same period reached out and spoke to more than 400 women in different parts of London. That included women who were rough sleeping. At the moment, we're supporting the rough sleeping counts that happen. So we go out with the local council professionals and help to find the women who are often not as obvious when they're rough sleeping as some of the men. And then also we're sometimes involved in visits to premises which are believed to be brothels in London. The police are sometimes interested to take us along with them because we can offer a kind of independent and separate support to women. We do that work under strict conditions that we're only going along with the police if we're guaranteed an opportunity to talk to women in private and where they don't feel obliged or looked on at by law enforcement. The reason that this work is necessary and that it has a very special style and method that's been developed over many years, which is used by women around the world, actually, a kind of a holistic and wraparound, thoughtful way of thinking what can really help and what can make a difference and what happens if we just try to walk the journey with you rather than tell you what to do. The reason it's very important is because of the very specific harms that women face that men don't face when they're in some of the same situations. So men who are homeless, who might have criminal justice histories, who might have mental health problems, who might be facing addictions, are not at all as subject to the high rates of histories of abuse in their lives as the women that we work with are. And neither are they at any considerable risk of being drawn into prostitution and sexual exploitation. And that difference in gender of both the drivers and the consequences around prostitution and sexual exploitation is extremely important. But what we do find is that in our public services, that isn't really recognised. So there isn't a lot of support from health through to employment and housing. There isn't recognition of the specific risks of sexual exploitation faced by women when they are in need. So that's a key reason why it's very important that services like ours can provide the support we do. I've touched on this a bit, but I think it's important to try and understand who are the women that we can be working with. So we are often working with women who have insecure housing situations, actually almost all of them. Complex mental health needs are common, and our mental health system can often pathologize women who are really struggling as a result of abuse, and can make them feel like the problem is inherent or in you, when actually presenting with a lot of difficulty and with trauma is often about what has happened to you. We are working with women who've got often a lifetime and very difficult problems around addictions. We're working with women who almost always have histories of abuse, domestic abuse and sexual abuse, trauma in their childhoods, for example. They may have been in and out of the criminal justice system, which once you have been, is constantly flagged and becomes can be a problem to navigate in all sorts of other parts of life. Women are trafficked, as we know, into sexual exploitation in Britain. That is a huge problem for the women who are listed on sexual services websites, for example, a huge set of those women. Women are also trafficked within Britain. So I think it's always important to remember that women are moved around the country and even moved around different brothels in the same city. So that movement of women for sexual exploitation is very, very common, and it's perhaps inherent to the contemporary arrangement of prostitution. Something I think it's important to flag, and that is not well understood or not well acknowledged. We believe that we work with a disproportionate number of women who have learning difficulties and/or autism, which are either diagnosed or not diagnosed. But when it features significantly in work like ours, it's very important to start asking the question of why is this? Why are some women being missed and not supported earlier in their lives for difficulties that they have? But why in particular, and what does it tell us about prostitution and sexual exploitation when these women become particularly subjected to harm? In terms of what contemporary prostitution is and what's happening in women's lives when we talk about prostitution and sexual exploitation, we are any week of the year, we're working with women who are involved in what most people understand as prostitution. So the exchange of sex acts for cash, perhaps. I think many people will be familiar with the fact that the majority of those transactions, if you like, are now brokered online rather than simply in the streets, which is, the history in Britain, like many other towns and cities in the world. Historically, you'd have seen women in the streets and men would know where to pick them up in their cars and so on, as well as other parts of the so-called sex industry. It's predominantly the form now that prostitution arrangements are made online, and then men will go to flats or to places where they can meet those women. I would say, however, it's important not to write off the very basic reality of prostitution in the street, which is persisting. I think we can get used to, when we look at the way digital changes our lives, assuming that everything is moving in one direction and that's what it's going to do. There is very real prostitution happening rather in London neighbourhoods, in London streets. And my colleagues who work in outreach with some of those women find that in some neighbourhoods, they believe it's, if not increasing, it certainly is quite open. It's happening during the daytime as well as at night. And the men who are picking women up seem to benefit from the feeling that this is an entirely cash transaction and nobody can see what I've done. So it's got an appeal exactly because of that anonymity that's involved in picking women up. And that, in our opinion, that's not going to stop. And all of us should think about what our response as a community is to that behaviour and to its harms. We're working as well with women who can be in complicated arrangements where they are what some people call exchanging sex for safety, for the basics of life, perhaps in relation to their addictions, sometimes because it's better still to be safe and inside with one man who's very difficult and who might harm you, but then to be left in even more desperate circumstances. So the complexities in those women's lives, the reasons that they found themselves in those situations, but nevertheless, the willingness of others, of men, to predate on them is very significant. And it's very significant in the community that we're based in King's Cross, which has got extreme wealth next to extreme poverty. Again, that's a question for all of us. That's a question for the community about why that happens right under our noses. We work with women who are who've been cuckooed, which is a term for when somebody has their property coercively, deceptively, forcibly occupied. And that behaviour, very common here, for example, where there's extreme housing pressure, that behaviour can be related to eventually to sexually coercive behaviour as well, and a lot of difficulty in those women's lives. We work with women where a man who may have presented himself originally, or who still does, as caring very much about her, as being her boyfriend and her long-term partner. So somebody who is a pimp stroke boyfriend is a very persistent model in what is going on around prostitution. I think that's one of the keys to understanding how economic disadvantage really drives women's experience of prostitution, but the actual mode of it and the way that women are drawn in and the way that they can find it very difficult to get out is to do with these complicated relationships with men who are deceptive and controlling and absolutely akin to domestically abusive husbands, partners, long-term boyfriends. We also find ourselves now in a way that I would say by research and so on is not well tracked, but we desperately need to understand it. We find that sexual exploitation is very, very bound up with online pornography, with newer so-called non-contact sexual services that are available online, with the way that pornography minimizes the harm of prostitution and the harm of other non-contact arrangements. And what you've got there is just a huge cluster of behaviors, opportunities for sexual exploitation, and a culture which minimizes the harm of any of them, all eventually still finding some of the most vulnerable women and enabling men to organize predation on some of those women. We might come back to some of that in the Q&A. This is kind of a short case study, if you like, that actually we use sometimes when we're talking to the local police. So we're fortunate to have an arrangement where we do training with new recruits to the local police force around here. So what we do is we show them the way that a woman can be described quite quickly by some professionals, by people who are working with her, and which does lead to her being sometimes dismissed or to being not cared about in the way that she deserves. So you might say of a woman, I hope my slide is well visible here. You might say that she came here on the back of a lorry anyway. She's had her children removed. She's got a history of violence and the law. She's a Class A drug user and she's been involved in prostitution. So tick, tick, tick. She's described, she's assigned, and the harms to her and her history is minimized. A different way of looking at this woman and a different way of understanding her is actually to take the time to unpack and to see that when she arrived in Britain, she had been trafficked and she'd already experienced sexual abuse in her family. The women who are trafficked to Britain for sexual exploitation don't have massively different histories and life stories to those who are trafficked and abused in prostitution here. That's a very important thing to understand. We can get into a notion that there's two sets of women, and certainly here we don't believe that's true. So those are the girls and women who are particularly vulnerable to being told by a new boyfriend or by somebody else who might be putting pressure on their family that perhaps we can sort you out or get you a different life in the UK or wherever. This woman may have had all of her children removed from her because she couldn't keep them safe, because that's what social services will do if they deem that your children are at risk, perhaps some dangerous men in your life, or because we believe there's prostitution, then that's what's going to happen to you. And that's very, very complicated and really, really hurts women. She has a history of violence and abuse in many of the relationships around her. When she was in prison, she had defended herself against an abusive partner. Her substance misuse was deeply related to the sexual exploitation that's happened to her. And the prostitution that she's experienced was absolutely organized by people who are intent on the sexual exploitation of her for their gain. So that, I hope you can see, is just a really different way of looking at the same life story. I wanted to try and make the connections with only kind of a few minutes to go here, with domestic abuse, which colleagues have talked about already this morning, and with why prostitution is part of violence against women, which is what the 16 days are about tackling. So I think it's not the most obvious form of abuse to some people. And I would say there is an enormous kind of political, economic interest in separating prostitution out and insisting that it's something different, insisting that it's a private consensual choice, insisting that lots of people involved in it are there by choice and it's their own business. The reality of looking at prostitution and who is in it, who is being harmed and how they got there, cannot but tell the story of how it is on an absolute continuum with other forms of violence against women and girls, in particular sexual abuse and domestic abuse. For England and Wales, the public data that we have from the ONS, which has been alluded to in the other presentations here, but right here, what we know we have is around 1 in 4 women experiencing domestic abuse during their lives, and 1 in 10 experiencing rape during their lives. That's women, and there are very different, much lower stats for men. What's important when we talk about lifetime experience of those things, which may be once or may sometimes be more than once, is that there is a subset of women who experience domestic and sexual abuse repeatedly and extensively throughout their lives. They first experience it in childhood, in the family, and then they experience it repeatedly with partners later on. Those women, as girls, experience from very, very early on the failure of adults and people who are supposed to care about them, protecting them. They experience an erosion of their bodily boundaries and, you know, the ability to develop that sense of this is mine, this belongs to me, and I decide what happens to it. And they experience lessons, very gendered lessons about what a woman is for. And that's important if you're trying to think about how does someone end up in prostitution? How is someone deceived and coerced into it? And what's the actual experience of that? The research that we have, and maybe we'll come back to it in Q&A, but the research is really inadequate. And to me, that means something as well. And it's because there isn't enough political and policy interest in finding out what is happening to who and committed by whom. So I think it's a political thing in itself, actually. But the research that we have tells us that women in prostitution invariably have histories of domestic and sexual abuse. They are, as a group, very disproportionately have been in the care system. That shames all of us, I think. They have first experienced prostitution as very young women and girls. They have complicated relationships with those who traffic or deceive them into it. And they have complicated relationships often, not always, but often with addictions. There can be a popular view, and certainly like I've encountered it with the police officers who train here, that it's a very simplistic, kind of temporarily simplistic view that some women are in prostitution to feed their addictions. Many women who find themselves caught up in prostitution were not addicts when they started in prostitution. They might have begun to use drugs or alcohol in order to numb themselves and to get through the experience. And that needs to be appreciated when later, if you're trying to address that problem in itself and the stuff that's then built up around it. I think something that's really, really important to do if you talk about prostitution is never to leave it being a story that's about women, because it's not a story that's about women. Prostitution is fundamentally about demand for prostitution. We wouldn't have a major social issue around it if many, many men weren't trying to pay for women in prostitution or find other ways to coercively, sexually exploit women. So it's important that we try and understand those men, their behaviors, what drives them, how they have a sense of impunity and what they're doing is socially acceptable, perhaps. And that kind of understanding is what's going to help us get to a different place on it. So the even more limited research that's been done on men who use women in prostitution tells us some of these things, that it's around 1 in 10 men, that's across different wealthy countries. When you ask them about their views towards women, they tend to have much more misogynistic views towards women than average men. The behavior of using women in prostitution usually starts quite young in life. An important thing for policymakers, these men have a strong belief that when they've paid for something, they are entitled to it. So any kind of view that you can make the men who use women in prostitution part of the solution to keeping some of those women safe, such as reporting it if they believe a woman is actually trafficked or truly being forced. The evidence about that shows both evidence from criminal justice, but also evidence from interviewing some of these men that they don't report it. So they are able to walk away and say, I think she was being used, or she might have been trafficked, but they don't do anything about it. That really, really matters. And then, of course, we know that prostitution is bound up with trafficking, both, as I've said, internally and across borders. Almost finally now, I was going to just end with there is some stuff that we think is really, really important at Women at the Well. So not only in doing our immensely important work in providing support to women, but also being here and available to talk about what the answers are supposed to be and the quite radical policy change that we need. So we're very aware, of course, of the endless debates about freedom of choice and about independence and about being about it being no one else's business what you do with your body. What we see day to day is that when you aggregate what is happening and who it's happening to, we are talking about an enormous threat to the dignity of particular groups of women, because there are those of us who are not at risk of this, but for the grace of God, and there are those for whom this is a reality and for whom what can happen to you is going to be minimized and ignored by others. So it is an extremely collective issue that we need to have kind of a really thoughtful cross-community discussion about. There are different legal models, which I won't spell out now at the kind of end of a presentation, but there are very different ways of dealing with it than the way it's currently than the way prostitution is currently addressed in Britain at the moment. In Britain, I think you could characterize what we've got as quite laissez-faire, which is some offences around, for example, soliciting or organising prostitution are criminalised, but effectively, most police forces don't enforce those and don't enforce much of the law against curb crawling, for example. But we haven't quite made our minds up about recognising prostitution as harmful, and we're certainly not funding and supporting agencies like ours to ensure there is the opportunity to exit and to get the support that you need. So we're ignoring it, and we're ignoring enormous harm and enormous human rights abuse, in fact. When we go back to the old cliches of saying an expression I can't stand, but oh, it's the oldest profession in the world, and ideas about prostitution being inevitable, which again is something that is said about rape and domestic abuse all the time. They're kind of inevitable, usually because of masculinity and so on. When we say that, we've given up hope. And if our project here is hope, then that's exactly the wrong thing to do. And that's where we should pull ourselves up. So thanks for listening to that, which